Every powerful creature has a limit. Rush destroys everything in its path. Figure detects any sound in any environment. Huggy Wuggy never fails when it's hunting. The prototype controls everything inside the factory. But what happens when creatures that never fail encounter something their rules cannot process? Stay until the end, because the answer will change how you see both universes. The prototype noticed the problem before any other entity did. He was monitoring the factory through the closed circuit cameras when the pressure sensor in Sector 8 triggered without an identifiable cause. No intruders. The experiments were in their sectors. The reading was of a door that did not exist in the Playtime Company infrastructure registry. He zoomed into the camera feed. The door was embedded in the wall of the Sector 8 access corridor with the absurd naturalness of something that had always been there. Dark wood, aged varnish, a golden handle. It was not a factory door. It was a hotel door. The prototype did not feel fear. He never felt fear. But he recognized, with the precision that defined every decision he made, that this was outside any variable his systems had been built to process. Before he could redirect Catnap to that corridor, the door opened. The dark substance that entered through the bottom gap was not water, not gas, not anything he had a classification for. It spread across the floor like ink released in slow motion, covering the old factory tiles in absolute silence. And then Seek crossed fully to the other side. Behind him, Rush. Behind Rush, Figure. Behind Figure, Eyes, Screech. Every entity from the hotel crossing into the factory without hesitation, because hesitation was never part of their nature. They did not know where they were. They simply continued being what they had always been. The prototype watched the first corridor get swept clean in under 3 seconds when Rush tore through it. And for the first time in his entire existence inside the Playtime Company, he did not know what to do with what he was seeing. The first consequence was immediate. Rush destroyed the ventilation pipes feeding Sector 8 in a single pass. The system Catnap used to distribute the red gas through that wing was severed in a fraction of a second. Catnap detected the pressure loss in the ducts and immediately began rerouting through the available lines. But to do that, he needed to move to Sector 7. And Sector 7 was where Figure had entered. Figure moved slowly along the surfaces, palms flat against the wall. The factory was noisier than the hotel. Metal structures transmitted vibration from far away. Pipes with residual pressure created constant low-frequency sound. Harder to separate useful information from noise, but not impossible. Catnap entered the corridor. Figure located the direction and advanced. Catnap released the red gas. The mist filled the corridor in seconds. But Figure did not use sight. The gas did not block sound. And the gas itself created sound as it left the ducts. And Figure adjusted direction without stopping. Catnap exited the corridor and sealed the isolation door behind him. In the core, the prototype logged the conclusion. The gas did not work on Figure. His containment protocols had a flaw he had never needed to identify before. If you're still here, stay, because what the prototype is about to understand will change everything you thought you knew about both worlds. Huggy Wuggy dropped from the ducts when Rush swept the storage wing for the second time. He calculated the trajectory. Rush cleared the corridor in the same direction every pass. Huggy Wuggy positioned himself at the intersection, arms pressed against both walls, blocking the path. Rush passed through him without slowing down. The impact sent Huggy Wuggy into the wall with enough force to bend the metal. He stayed on the floor, processing, not with pain, with something close to a revision of hypothesis. Rush was not big or small, not fast or slow in any way he understood speed. It was pure pattern without identifiable mass. He waited at the intersection again, was thrown again. When he got up the second time, he went straight for the ducts. Not because he gave up, because he recalibrated to the approach he always used with intruders too fast for direct confrontation. In the core, the prototype watched the patterns collide in cascade. Seek had covered the floor of 3 full floors. The smiling critters, who circulated through the lower corridors, simply stopped. The substance was not temperature, not gas, not anything they had a response protocol for. And when they stopped circulating, Mommy Longlegs lost the peripheral senses she used to monitor her sectors. Mommy Longlegs entered the corridor to check personally and found eyes. Eyes did not hunt the way she understood hunting. It did not pursue. It did not threaten. It simply existed, spread across the ceiling in multiple pairs that did not blink, did not look away, that fixed on everything at once with no hierarchy of focus. Mommy Longlegs looked up and found dozens of eyes looking back at her. She froze, not from fear, from calculation. She always calculated before acting, but there was no calculation possible for something that did not move, did not make sound, did not present any of the variables her games used as leverage. "What kind of creature?" she said slowly, her voice low. "Wants nothing from me." No response. She retreated. The prototype logged Mommy Longlegs' withdrawal. It was the second time in minutes that an experiment had retreated from a hotel entity without being attacked. The factory was responding as if the invaders were a conventional threat, but the hotel entities were not conventional. They had no objectives, no directed aggression. They were fixed behavioral patterns operating in an environment they did not recognize, and the factory was being systematically disrupted not by attack, but by incompatibility. That distinction changed everything. The prototype had studied creatures his entire existence, not the way scientists studied, with protocols and reports, the way only an entity that survived decades inside the factory could study, observing behavior until he could predict every reaction before it happened. That was what made him dangerous. Not strength, not speed. The capacity to anticipate. None of the hotel entities were predictable in that way. Rush had no objective. It had direction. An objective can be interrupted, redirected, used as leverage. A direction simply continues as long as there is space ahead. Figure had no strategy. It had precision. A strategy can be defeated with another strategy. Precision only stops when the stimulus stops. And removing all sound from an industrial factory was impossible. Seek was not a creature. It was an environment. Containing it would mean containing the entire floor of the factory. The prototype stood motionless before the monitors. These creatures had no identification numbers, no procedure scars. They were not laboratory products. They were something entirely outside the parameters the Playtime Company had established as possible. "You were not manufactured," he said to himself. But what came after that was more important. Manufactured creatures could be modified, reprogrammed, absorbed. That was the only power he needed inside the factory. Creatures that were not manufactured had no entry point for that process. They did not respond to modification. They did not respond to control. For the first time, he understood that there was something that did not respond, and that there was an entire place where creatures like that existed. The connection began to fail 94 minutes after the door had opened. There was no warning. The corridors simply began losing coherence, as if the geometry holding them to the hotel was being pulled back toward its origin. Rush swept the return corridor one final time. Seek contracted and was absorbed. Figure stopped in the middle of Sector 7, heard the silence that preceded every hotel transition, and left without ever understanding where it had been. Screech stayed until the end. He and Catnap were in the same dark corridor when the door closed, and Screech disappeared the way he always disappeared. Without warning, without a trace, as if he had never existed outside the dark that created him. The factory fell silent, but it did not return to what it was before. The marks Rush left in the Sector 8 walls were too deep to ignore. The ventilation pipes feeding Catnap's gas system in that wing were gone. Seek had left residue across 3 floors, and the smiling critters that had stopped circulating had still not resumed movement. The factory was physically different, and the prototype knew it would stay that way. He remained in the core, staring at the empty corridors. The question that opened this video had an answer now. What happens when creatures that never fail encounter something their rules cannot process? They do not fail. They continue being exactly what they are. And that is precisely what destroys everything around them. Rush did not fail. Figure did not fail. Seek did not fail. They were completely faithful to their nature in an environment that was not prepared for that nature. And the factory paid the price not for being attacked, but for being simply incompatible. The prototype logged the conclusion. There was something in the outside world that could not be controlled, not because it was stronger, but because it existed according to rules completely different from the ones he knew. And against something like that, control was not a tool. It was only an illusion. He had never needed to know that before, because there had never been anything outside the factory worth understanding. Now there was. And that changed every calculation he had made about what would come after he finally got out of here.